Nobody ever looked twice at the lower docks of Farpoint Relay. The corridors smelled like engine grease and recycled air. The lighting was always a shade too dim, and the only sound were the grinding of cargo lifts and the occasional beep of a scanner confirming weight limits. It was the kind of place where things got moved, but nothing ever happened, and the beings who worked there preferred it that way. Daniel had been hauling crates on Deck 14 for 11 months. He was one of only 3 humans on the entire station, and the other 2 worked in sanitation on the far side of the ring. He did not mind the solitude. He showed up, scanned his manifest, loaded his lifter, and moved containers from Bay A to Bay B until his shift ended. The alien workers around him, tall Bravari dock chiefs, squat Moloch freight handlers, a few insectoid Chivri who clicked and hummed as they sorted shipments, treated him the way most species treated humans. Politely, distantly, like he was a piece of furniture that occasionally needed to be spoken to. He never complained. He did his work, ate alone in the lower mess hall, and slept in a quarters unit barely wide enough to stretch his arms. If anyone had asked him whether he was happy, he would have shrugged and said he was fine. But nobody asked. Rena had no reason to be on Deck 14 that afternoon. She was a communications liaison, which meant her entire job existed 4 levels above, in the bright and busy administrative ring where diplomats argued and trade agreements were signed in 17 languages. But a misrouted cargo tag had flagged in her system, a container of Selvari medical supplies that had been scanned into the wrong bay, and station protocol required a liaison to physically verify the correction. She walked quickly through the lower corridors, her silver skin catching the harsh overhead lights, her dark eyes scanning bay numbers as she passed. Selvari were not common on trading stations this far out. Most of her kind preferred homeworld assignments or embassy postings where the telepathic noise of other species was manageable. Rena had chosen Farpoint because she wanted distance from the constant hum of Selvari minds. Alien thoughts were quieter, easier to ignore. Surface-level intentions, simple needs, nothing that lingered. She found Bay 12 and was checking the container seal when it hit her. It was not a thought. It was not words or images in any structured sense. It was a wave, dense, hot, and overwhelming, like stepping into a room that was on fire, but the fire was made of feeling. Grief, so sharp it cut. Warmth, so deep it ached. And underneath it all, a face. A small face. A girl young, maybe 8 or 9 years old, with dark hair and a gap-toothed smile, laughing at something just out of frame. Rena staggered. Her hand shot out and grabbed the edge of the container to steady herself. Her breath came fast. She looked around wildly, trying to find the source, because that signal had not come from any species she recognized. Bravari minds felt like smooth water. Moloch minds felt like static. Chivri minds were barely perceptible at all. This was none of those. This was raw, unfiltered, loud in a way that was not about volume, but about depth. She found him. 30 meters away, a human male in a gray station jumpsuit was stacking crates onto a lifter. His face was completely blank. His hands moved with the slow, mechanical rhythm of someone who had done this 10,000 times. There was nothing about him that suggested anything was happening inside his head at all. But his mind was screaming, not in pain, not in panic. It was screaming the way a storm screams, with everything at once. The little girl was there, vivid and bright, and so was a green field under gray sky and rain hitting skin and the smell of something cooking in a kitchen that did not exist on any space station and a hand, small, fragile, resting inside a larger one, and a feeling of desperate, crushing love tangled with a loss so complete it had no bottom. Rena could not move. She stood there, one hand on the container, her chest tight, her dark eyes locked on the human who had no idea she existed in that moment. She had been a telepath her entire life. She had trained at the Selvari Institute for 3 years. She had been taught that human minds were closed systems, chaotic, primitive, unreadable. Every textbook, every instructor, every scientific paper said the same thing. Humans were telepathic dead zones. Background noise at best. They were wrong. She watched him finish his stack, wipe his forehead with the back of his hand, and move to the next row of crates. The wave faded as he focused on the physical task, but it did not disappear. It just went deeper, settling into a low hum beneath his surface thoughts, like music playing in another room. Rena verified the cargo tag with shaking hands, marked the correction in her system, and walked out of the bay without looking back. She made it to the lift, stepped inside, and leaned against the wall as the doors closed. Her reflection stared back at her from the polished metal, silver skin, wide dark eyes, and an expression she did not recognize on her own face. That night, in her quarters, she searched the Galactic Medical Database for anything on human telepathic signatures. She found almost nothing. A few dismissive papers from Bravari researchers. A single Selvari study from 40 years ago that concluded human neural activity was too disorganized to produce coherent telepathic output. She closed the files and sat in the dark. They were not disorganized. They were carrying something so heavy and so constant that no other species had ever evolved the capacity to do it, and they did it every single second of every single day without anyone in the galaxy knowing. She was going back to Deck 14 tomorrow. Rena told herself it was scientific curiosity. A telepath encountering an anomaly had every right to investigate further, and that was all this was. An anomaly. A glitch in the accepted understanding of human neurology. She was simply gathering data. She went back the next day, and the day after, and the day after that. Each time she found a reason, a misrouted shipment, a docking schedule that needed physical confirmation, a supply audit that could only be done on site. Her supervisor did not question it. Liaisons moved through the station freely, and nobody paid attention to where a Selvari walked as long as her reports were filed on time. Daniel was always there. Same shift, same bay, same gray jumpsuit. He moved crates, checked manifests, exchanged brief words with the Moloch workers, and ate his lunch sitting on an upturned container with his back against the wall. He was unremarkable in every visible way, but his mind never stopped. Rena learned to position herself within range without being obvious. 30 meters was the outer edge. 20 was clearer. At 10 meters, his thoughts became so vivid she could almost taste them. She sat in an alcove near Bay 12 with a datapad on her lap, pretending to work, and let his mind wash over her in waves. The girl was always there. Always. Not as a single memory, but as a presence woven into everything he thought and felt. When he lifted a heavy crate, the strain in his arms reminded him of carrying her on his shoulders when she was small. When he heard the Chivri workers laughing in their clicking language, something in the sound pulled up an echo of the girl giggling at a joke he could not quite remember. When the shift alarm chimed at the end of the day, he felt the same hollow drop in his stomach that he had felt standing in a white room when a different kind of alarm had gone silent. IT was relentless. It never turned off. And the most disturbing part was that Daniel showed none of it. His face stayed calm. His voice stayed even. He nodded politely at coworkers, said please and thank you, and walked through his days like a man with nothing on his mind at all. Rena had worked with Bravari diplomats whose surface thoughts were so carefully controlled that reading them required deep focus. She had processed communications from Moloch traders whose minds were simple and transactional. She had once briefly sensed a Chivri hive leader whose thoughts came as interlocking patterns of duty and function. All of them were manageable, structured, contained. Daniel was none of those things. His mind was an open wound dressed in silence, and he walked through the station carrying it the same way he carried cargo, steadily, without complaint, as if the weight was simply part of being alive. That on the fourth day, something changed. Rena was in her usual alcove when Daniel finished stacking a row of containers and turned to grab his water flask. His eyes swept the corridor as he drank, and they landed on her. She froze. He lowered the flask and gave a small, uncertain nod. Then he walked over. His thoughts hit her like a wall at 5 meters. Nervousness. A quick flash of self-consciousness about his dusty jumpsuit and unwashed hands. A tiny spark of something warm. Not attraction exactly, but a simple, honest gladness that another person was nearby and had made eye contact. Underneath all of that, the ever-present hum. The girl. The rain. The lost dot. He stopped a polite distance away and said hello. Just that. A single word in a quiet voice. Rena opened her mouth to respond, and the full force of his emotional state poured through the gap in her concentration. She felt his loneliness, not the shallow kind that comes from being alone for an afternoon, but the deep, structural kind that had been built into him over years, layer by layer, until it was part of his architecture. She felt his hope, absurd and desperate, that this stranger sitting in an alcove might simply talk to him for a few minutes. She felt his preemptive acceptance that she probably would not. She managed to say hello back. Her voice came out unsteady. Daniel noticed. His thoughts shifted instantly. Concern, followed by a quick assumption that he had intruded on her space, followed by a decision to apologize and leave. He was already building the sentence in his head when Rena forced herself to add a second line. She asked him how long he had been working on the station. The relief that flooded his mind was so intense, she nearly gasped. He answered, 11 months. He asked if she was new to the lower decks. She said she was handling some cargo audits. He nodded and said the lower docks were not much to look at, but the work was honest. She said honest work mattered. He smiled, and when he smiled, the girl in his mind smiled too, and the warmth that radiated from him was so fierce and so tender that Rena had to look away and pretend to check her data pad. They talked for 6 minutes. She counted afterward. 6 minutes of simple, meaningless conversation about shift schedules and station food, and the way the artificial gravity felt slightly heavier on the lower decks. 6 minutes during which Daniel's visible self was polite, calm, and slightly awkward, and his invisible self was blazing like a star, grateful and terrified and hopeful and grieving all at the same time, layer on top of each other without separation, every emotion alive and present and carried simultaneously. When she left, his thoughts followed her down the corridor. Not intentionally. He did not know she could hear them. But the last thing she caught before she stepped into the lift was a single, quiet feeling. the hope that she might come back tomorrow. She stood in the lift with her hands pressed flat against the wall and her eyes closed, and she felt something she had no Selvari word for. She went back tomorrow. The medical wing on level 8 was quiet during the late shift. Most species on Farpoint Relay handled their ailments during standard hours, which meant the corridors were nearly empty when Rena walked in and found Dr. Selvon reviewing patient files behind a curved glass desk. Selvon was old by Selvari standards. His silver skin had faded to a pale gray at the temples, and his dark eyes carried the dull sheen of someone who had spent decades reading the surface thoughts of anxious patients. He looked up when Rena entered and already knew she was troubled before she said a word. She sat down across from him and asked about human neurology. Selvon leaned back and gave her the standard answer. Humans were telepathically inert. Their neural architecture was dense but disorganized, a product of evolutionary pressures that prioritize survival over cognitive efficiency. Their prefrontal cortex generated enormous amounts of activity, but it was noise, emotional static with no coherent telepathic signature. He had treated a few human patients over the years. Headaches mostly, trouble sleeping. Their minds were loud up close, but structurally unreadable. Rena asked him what he meant by loud. He shrugged. He said humans thought about too many things at once. Most species compartmentalized. When a Bravari was working, it thought about work. When a Moloch was eating, it thought about food. When a Selvari was reading another mind, it focused on the signal and filtered out everything else. Humans could not do that. Or rather, they did not. Their brains ran everything simultaneously: memory, emotion, sensory processing, abstract planning, social calculation, all layered on top of each other at all times. He called it a design flaw, an evolutionary shortcut that traded mental clarity for raw processing volume. Rena asked if that meant human was always feeling everything at once. Selvon paused. He said that was one way to describe it. A human sitting in a room eating a meal was simultaneously remembering other meals, anticipating future ones, processing the emotional weight of whoever they were eating with or the absence of someone who should have been there, running background calculations about their safety and status, and experiencing whatever ambient grief or joy or anxiety their life had accumulated, all without conscious effort, all without stopping, all running underneath whatever they were visibly doing and saying. He said it sounded exhausting. He said it probably was. Rena thanked him and left. She did not go back to her quarters. She went to the lower docks. Daniel was on his break. He sat on his usual crate near Bay 12, eating something from a sealed container, station rations, the same bland nutrient blocks everyone on the lower decks ate. He saw her coming, and his face changed. Not dramatically, just a slight lift at the corners of his mouth, a shift in his posture, a small opening in the wall he kept around himself. His mind opened wider. She felt it before she reached him. The gladness, the nervousness, the quick, involuntary flash of the girl. Hannah. The name surfaced clearly for the first time, because something about Rena's approach, the way she walked toward him without hesitation, reminded him of the way his sister used to run across a yard to greet him when he came home. He buried it fast, pushed it down beneath his surface thoughts. But it had already reached her. She sat on a crate across from him and asked if she could join him for a few minutes. He said yes immediately, then worried he had answered too fast, then told himself to stop overthinking, then felt a flush of gratitude that she had asked at all. All of this happened in less than 2 seconds. All of it was invisible on his face. They talked. She asked where he was from on Earth. He said a city called Leiden in the Netherlands. Small, old, full of canals and bicycles. She asked if he missed it. He said sometimes. His mouth said sometimes. His mind said every single day, every hour, in ways he could not describe because the missing was not a thought, but a texture that lived inside everything he touched and saw and heard. She asked how long he had been off Earth. He said 4 years. He had signed up for off-world labor contracts after his sister passed. He said it casually, the way humans said devastating things, quickly, lightly, with a small shrug that was meant to signal that the topic was closed. But his mind did not close. It cracked open. She saw Hannah clearly. 7 years old. A bicycle accident on a canal bridge that should have been minor but was not. Head trauma. 3 weeks in a hospital where machines breathed for her and Daniel sat beside the bed, reading stories she could not hear. A morning when the doctors said there was nothing more to be done. A hand inside his hand, growing cooler than a decision made in an empty apartment 6 months later to leave the planet entirely because the canals and the bicycles and the bridges were not scenery anymore. They were ghosts. Daniel was still talking. He was saying something about the station food being worse than Dutch cafeteria meals, making a small joke, smiling. And beneath the smile, beneath the joke, beneath the calm and steady voice of a man who had learned to function around his own destruction, was a loneliness so vast and so carefully managed that it took Rena's breath away. She was not just sensing his thoughts anymore. She was sitting inside them, feeling them as if they were her own, and the weight was staggering. Not because it was alien, because it was not. It was recognizable. It was grief and love pressed together so tightly they had become the same thing, and he carried both without ever setting either down. She looked at him, this quiet, ordinary human in a dusty jumpsuit eating bland food on an upturned crate in the worst part of a forgotten station. And she understood something that no Salvari textbook had ever taught her. He was not broken. He was full, completely, impossibly, unbearably full. And he had no idea that anyone could see it. The observation lounge on level 6 had one long window that curved along the outer hull of the station. Ships came and went in the distance. Freighters, patrol craft, the occasional passenger liner sliding toward the docking ring like a slow silver fish. It was the only place on Farpoint Relay where a person could sit and see the stars without a work schedule telling them when to look away. Daniel had mentioned it during one of their dock conversations, casually, the way he mentioned most things, as if sharing a small fact about the station rather than admitting that he sometimes went there alone after his shift to sit in the quiet and feel something larger than the cargo bay. Rena had heard the deeper truth underneath. She had felt the ache of a man who stared at stars because they did not remind him of anything he had lost. She suggested they go together. He said sure, as if it did not matter. His mind said it mattered more than anything that had happened to him in months. They sat in 2 chairs near the far end of the window, with a lounge curved away from the main foot traffic. A few Bravari officers passed through, nodded politely, and left. A Moloch maintenance worker sat at the opposite end, eating a snack, completely uninterested in them. For the most part, they were alone. Daniel talked about Earth. He told her about Leiden. The cobblestone streets. The way the university buildings looked in autumn when the trees turned orange and gold. The small bakery near his apartment that sold stroopwafels warm from the press. He told her about the canal boats and the way light moved on water in the early morning. He told her about his mother, who taught music at a primary school. and his father, who repaired old clocks in a shop that smelled like oil and wood. His voice was steady. His words were careful, measured, chosen to paint a pleasant picture without too much weight. He was good at this. He had practiced it, the art of talking about a life without revealing how much it cost him to remember it. But Rena was not listening to his words. She was inside the story beneath the story. And it was devastating. Every image he described came to her doubled. The cobblestones were not just cobblestones. They were the specific stretch of path where Hannah had learned to ride her bicycle, wobbling and laughing while Daniel jogged beside her with his hand on the seat. The bakery was not just a bakery. It was the place where he had taken Hannah every Saturday morning, and she had always asked for 2 stroopwafels, one for now and one for later, and later never came fast enough, so she always ate both before they reached the canal. The canal boats were not just boats. They were the bridge. He did not say the word bridge. He did not mention Hannah at all, but his mind went there anyway, dragged by the gravity of a memory that lived at the center of every other memory, pulling everything toward it. Rena saw it in fragments. A bright afternoon, a bicycle tire catching on a wet rail, a sound that was too small and too fast to be as final as it was. And then the hospital, the white room, the machines, the hand. She turned her face toward the window because her eyes were wet and she could not let him see. Salvari did not cry the way humans did. They did not produce tears in the same volume or with the same visible distress. But their eyes darkened when emotion overwhelmed their composure, shifting from their usual black to a deep, liquid indigo that any Salvari would recognize immediately. Rena pressed her fingertips against her knee and forced herself to breathe, Daniel noticed. He stopped mid-sentence. Something about the way Dutch rain felt different from station humidity, and looked at her with quiet concern. "Are you all right?" he asked. She said the starlight was bright. A stupid lie. He glanced at the window, which showed nothing but the distant glow of a cargo freighter's engines, and he knew it was a lie. But he did not push. Humans, she was learning, had an entire social architecture built around allowing each other to lie about small things in order to preserve dignity. He simply nodded and changed the subject, but his thoughts shifted. He wondered if he had said something wrong. He replayed the last few minutes in his head, scanning for the moment he might have gone too far, talked too much, been too honest about a life that was gone. He decided he had been boring. He decided she was uncomfortable. He decided, with the quiet certainty of a man who had been alone for a very long time, that this was the part where people started pulling away. Rena felt every bit of it. The self-blame, the retreat, the familiar architecture of a man preparing to be left again so that it would hurt less when it happened. She did not leave. She asked him what stroopwafels tasted like. His mind went still for half a second, a kind of stunned pause, and then he smiled. A real smile. Not the polite, managed one he wore on the docks. A smile that reached his eyes and, beneath them, reached the place where Hannah lived, because the question had landed exactly where Saturday mornings still existed. He described the taste. Warm caramel between thin waffle layers, slightly crispy at the edges, soft in the middle. He said they were better when you ate them on top of a hot cup of coffee, so the steam softened the caramel. He said his sister had never had the patience for that. He stopped. The word sister hung in the air between them like a door he had not meant to open. His thoughts scrambled. Close it, change the subject, laugh it off. But it was too late. Rena sat with the weight of it and said nothing. She did not need to. She already knew everything behind that door. And the only thing she did not know was whether carrying his grief without his knowledge was the most compassionate thing she had ever done or the worst violation she had ever committed. She stayed for another hour. They watched the ships. He did not mention Hannah again, but she was there in every silence between his sentences, in every star he looked at through the glass, in every breath he took that carried the shape of a name he could not say. When Rena returned to her quarters that night, she sat in the dark for a long time and did not move. Rena stopped going to the docks. She did not plan it. She woke up on the fifth morning and lay in her bunk staring at the ceiling, and the thought of walking down to deck 14 and sitting near Daniel while his unguarded mind poured his most private grief into her, without his knowledge, made her feel something she had never felt before in her life. Shame. She had been trained to read minds. Every Selvari with active telepathic ability went through the Institute, and the first thing they taught was the boundary doctrine. You do not enter without invitation. You do not take what is not offered, and you do not carry what does not belong to you. Surface-level impressions were natural and unavoidable. Intentions, moods, the general emotional weather of a room, those were fair. But what she had been doing with Daniel was not surface level. She had been sitting inside his deepest memories, watching him grieve a dead child and feeling emotions he had never chosen to share with anyone. The fact that his mind broadcast without his knowledge did not make it consent. The fact that she had not gone looking for it did not make it ethical. She had heard. She had stayed. She had come back for more. And the worst part was that she had not done it for science or duty or any reason she could defend. She had done it because his inner world was the most beautiful and terrible thing she had ever encountered, and she could not stop at she stopped going. Daniel noticed on the first day. By the second day, his thoughts, which she could still faintly sense from 4 levels away if she let her guard down, had shifted from confusion to the familiar, well-worn pattern she had come to recognize. He assumed she had lost interest. He assumed he had been too much. He began the slow, quiet process of closing the door she had opened in him, and the resignation in his mind was so practiced and so automatic that it made Rena want to break something. WY the third day, she felt him thinking about her specifically, and the thought was worse than grief. It was gratitude. He was grateful for the few conversations they had shared. He was not angry. He was not bitter. He was simply folding her away into the same place where he kept every good thing that had ended, carefully, gently, with the understanding that warmth was always temporary and the only reliable thing in his life was the work and the silence. That on the 4th day, Rena made a decision. She waited until the shift ended. She knew his schedule by heart, which was another thing she felt ashamed of. She went to the cargo bay on deck 14 after the last Moloch handler had clocked out, and she found Daniel alone, running a final inventory check on his datapad. The bay was dim. The air smelled like metal and packing material. He looked up when he heard her footsteps, and his face went through 3 expressions in 1 second: surprise, warmth, and then the careful blankness of a man who did not want to seem too glad. His mind was not blank at all. It surged toward her like a wave that had been held back by a wall, and the wall had just cracked. She stood 10 meters away and said his name. He put down the datapad and waited. She told him she needed to say something, and she needed him to let her finish before he responded. He nodded slowly, his thoughts already bracing for something bad, because in his experience, conversations that started this way always ended with someone leaving. Rena told him the truth. She said she was telepathic. She said Selvari could sense surface-level thoughts of most species, and that human minds were supposed to be unreadable. She said his was not. She said she had been hearing him, not just his words, not just his moods, but the deep, constant, unfiltered core of his emotional world, since the first day she had walked through the docks. She said she had heard the little girl. She said she had felt the hospital. She said she had carried his grief in her own chest for days without telling him, and she was telling him now because he deserved to know, and she was sorry. She said she was sorry 3 times. Daniel did not move. His mind, for the first time since she had known him, went completely quiet. Not empty, quiet, like a room where someone had just turned off a machine that had been running for years, and the silence was so sudden and so total that it had its own weight. He looked at her for a long time. Then he asked one question. "Did you hear Hannah?" His voice cracked on the name. It was the first time he had said it out loud to another person in 4 years, and the sound of it in the empty cargo bay was small and enormous at the same time. Rena nodded. She could not speak. Daniel sat down on a crate, slowly, like a man whose legs had decided to stop working. He put his hands on his knees and stared at the floor, and his mind, his vast, roaring, impossible mind, did something she had never felt before. It opened. Completely. Not in pain or panic, but in relief. Like a man who had been holding his breath for years and had just been told he was allowed to exhale. He said, "Thank you." Rena had expected anger. She had prepared for it, rehearsed responses, braced for the justified fury of a man whose privacy had been violated at the deepest possible level. He said thank you because no one had remembered Hannah with him in 4 years. He had been carrying her alone in a galaxy that did not know she had ever existed, and the weight of that solitude was worse than the grief itself. The grief he could bear, the aloneness he could not. And now someone else knew her name, that he sat on the crate in the dim cargo bay, and he did not cry, but his mind wept openly, and for the first time he knew someone was listening. Rena sat down beside him. She did not touch him. She did not speak. She simply sat, and she let the wave come, and she carried it with him the way she should have from the beginning. Not in secret, but in witness. They stayed like that for a long time. Word traveled fast on a station the size of Farpoint Relay, especially when it involved something that was not supposed to be possible. A Selvari telepath had read a human mind. Not surface noise, not ambient static, but deep structured thought, memory, emotion, identity. The kind of reading that was only supposed to work between Selvari, and even then only under controlled conditions. That be why the end of the week, Rena received a formal summons from the station's interspecies conduct board. It was a small panel, a Bravari administrator named Tolek, who managed diplomatic protocols, a Chivri social analyst designated as Observer Kith, and a senior Moloch medical ethicist named Grin. They met in a conference room on level 9 with curved walls and cold lighting, and they asked Rena to sit across from them at a table that felt much wider than it was. Tolek spoke first. He said the board had received reports of unauthorized telepathic contact with a human crew member. He said the matter raised serious questions about consent, privacy, and the potential need for new regulations governing Selvari-human interaction on mixed stations. He said a formal inquiry would determine whether restrictions were necessary. Grin added that there were medical concerns. If human minds were readable, the implications for labor contracts, security clearances, and diplomatic negotiations were significant. Humans might need to be reassigned away from telepathic species entirely. Observer Kith clicked softly and noted that the Chivery Collective had long considered human emotional output to be a form of low-level interference. If it was now proven that this interference contained structured, readable content, it might be classified as an involuntary broadcast, a category that, under galactic communication law, could be regulated or suppressed. Rena listened to all of this with her hands folded on the table and her face still. Then they asked her to describe what she had sensed. She was quiet for a moment. Not because she did not know what to say, but because she was deciding how to say it. She looked at the three officials sitting across from her. A Bravari who processed decisions like equations, a Moloch who experienced the world in blunt, practical terms, and a Chivery whose consciousness was distributed across a collective that shared function but not feeling. None of them would understand. Not fully, but she was going to try. She said she had sensed a human mind, and it was not noise. It was not static. It was not a design flaw or an evolutionary mistake or an involuntary broadcast that needed to be regulated. She said the human mind she had read belonged to a cargo handler who worked 12-hour shifts on the lowest deck of the station, doing a job no one noticed for pay that barely covered his quarters. He was not a diplomat. He was not a scientist. He was not anyone the galaxy would ever consider important. And inside his head, running constantly, without pause, without relief, without any hope of being seen or understood by anyone around him, was the most extraordinary thing she had ever encountered in her career as a telepath. She said he carried his dead, not as a memory filed away, not as a processed trauma stored in a compartment and closed. He carried his dead sister, a 7-year-old girl named Hannah, in every waking moment of his life. She was in the way he lifted crates, in the way he watched ships through a window, in the way he ate his meals alone, in the way he smiled at a stranger who sat down beside him. She lived in him the way blood lived in him, constantly moving, constantly present, part of the system that kept him functioning. And he did not do this because he was damaged. He did this because he had loved someone, and humans do not stop loving people when they die. They carry them. They carry them in a frequency so dense, so layered, so impossibly compressed that no other telepathic species in the known galaxy had ever evolved the neural architecture to sustain it. A Selvari who carried that kind of weight for even a day would need medical intervention. A Bravari mind would shut down. A Chivery collective would fragment. Daniel had been carrying it for 4 years. While stacking crates, while eating alone, while saying please and thank you to people who looked through him, she paused. The room was silent. She said that if this board wanted to classify human emotional output as interference, they were free to do so. If they wanted to restrict humans from working near telepathic species, that was their authority. If they wanted to study it, regulate it, suppress it, contain it, they could try. But she wanted them to understand what they would be regulating. They would be regulating love, not the shallow, transactional kind that most galactic species practiced, not the contractual bonding of Bravari partnerships or the functional attachment protocols of Chivery Hive units. They would be regulating the kind of love that survives death and does not diminish, does not fade, does not resolve. The kind that a quiet man on a forgotten deck carries every second of every day without asking anyone to notice and without expecting anyone to care. She said the galaxy had spent decades calling humans primitive because their minds were loud and their emotions were uncontrolled. She said the galaxy was wrong. Humans were not uncontrolled. They were carrying more than any species in the galaxy had ever been asked to carry, And they did it standing up, and they did it in silence. And they did it while still finding the capacity to smile at a stranger and ask how her day was going. She said that was not a flaw. That was the most remarkable thing she had ever witnessed in any mind of any species on any world. The board did not respond immediately. Tolek looked at his datapad, grinned, stared at the table. Observer Kith was still. Rena stood up and walked out. Daniel was sitting on a bench in the corridor outside. He did not know what she had said. He did not know the board existed or that his mind had become the subject of an interspecies policy discussion. He just knew that Rena had been called somewhere official, and he had come to wait because that was what you did when someone mattered to you. She came through the door and saw him, and his mind, that vast, impossible, beautiful engine of grief and hope and stubborn, relentless love, reached for her before his hands did. She took his hand without a word. They walked back toward the observation lounge, side by side, through the bright corridors of a station full of species who would never understand what they were looking at when they looked at a human being. His mind was loud, confused, hopeful, terrified, grateful, all at once, layered and tangled and burning, the way human minds always were. She held on tighter. The galaxy would learn. Eventually. But she already knew.